We're here tonight to talk about chronic wasting disease, in particular chronic wasting disease potential management strategies for the Laramie Mountains mule deer herd unit. We're going to have 3 presentations. It should take no longer than an hour and a half, and then we'll open it up for questions. So our first presenter will be Hank Edwards. He's our supervisor out at our state lab, and he's going to give a presentation on chronic wasting disease, basically chronic wasting disease 101. And then I will talk about our actual CWD management plan, and then talk about the Laramie Mountains mule deer herd, the current status of that herd as it pertains to the population and its prevalence with chronic wasting disease, and then talk about possible management strategies for that herd.
So, welcome everybody. Again, my name is Hank Edwards, and I run the Wildlife Health Laboratory for the Wyoming Game and Fish. Our job with the Wildlife Health Laboratory is to monitor diseases in all of wildlife, but most of what we do is chronic wasting disease. So if you collected a sample and sent it to us, odds are that we were the ones who tested it and turned those results around back to you. So I've got a presentation that's about 28 slides or so, and I'm going to talk about the basics of chronic wasting disease. I'll talk about our surveillance efforts briefly. I'll talk about where this disease is found in Wyoming and at what prevalence, and then finally I'll talk about things that all of us can do to maybe help this disease, and I'll turn it over to Martin as he talks about the plan. So to kick it off, chronic wasting disease, what is it? It is a fatal nervous system disease, white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, moose, reindeer, caribou. Causative agent is a prion, or an infectious protein. We know about viruses and we know about bacteria, but proteins are a little bit different. They're much different, a little harder for us to deal with. Similar diseases in animals include VSE, or mad cow disease, scraping sheep, or other diseases. There's many other prion diseases in animals. And of course, humans have their own as well. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, Kuru, etc. But this chronic wasting disease is not just a problem in Wyoming, right? Chronic wasting disease now occurs in 26 of our 50 states, as well as Canada, as well as Norway, Finland, South Korea, and Sweden. So this is a worldwide problem, not just in Wyoming. So getting back to a prion and what makes it so much different, a normal prion, or normal protein, just called a prion, those happen to occur in most mammalian cells, but they tend to predominate in the nervous system cells. What happens when the abnormal prion protein, shown here, comes in contact with that protein that kind of looks like a chair, if you will, it forces that normal prion to change its conformation. And when it changes its conformation, it becomes incredibly resistant. It's resistant to most chemicals, most disinfectants. It's resistant to desiccation by the sun, UV radiation. All those things that would kill a bacteria or a virus don't have any effect on a prion. So one of the problems is when that protein changes its shape, the body can't get rid of it with its normal enzymes. So those prions build up and they build up and they build up, and they slowly over time kill cells in the central nervous system. They kill neurons. So as more and more of those holes form, that's where we get the changes in behavior. So this is what a normal brain looks like, and this is what it looks like with a little bit of CWD. So as those neurons die, then the animals slowly get to the point where you see those clinical signs of the disease, but that isn't until the last 4 to 8 weeks. So those classical signs, I'm sure you all know: weight loss, drooling, behavioral changes, hair coat changes, droopy ears, just lack of general awareness, right? The lights are on, but nobody's home. But again, those signs don't show up until the last 4 to 8 weeks of the disease, whereas they can be infected for 1.5 years, maybe 2 years before those signs appear. So that's where it really gets hunters when they harvest an animal with very good shape, lots of fat, and yet it tests strongly positive for chronic wasting disease. And that's because this incubation period is so long. We know that this disease is transmitted animal to animal as well as environment to animal. And animals can become infected when they come in contact with contaminated soil, plants, anything that's contaminated with saliva, urine, and feces. We know that prions are shed in those, particularly in saliva. They can also become infected when they come in contact with contaminated surfaces like mineral licks or feeders or troughs. We know that carcasses can spread this disease because carcasses serve as a source for these prions and could be transmitted, of course, to susceptible animals. And the problem is these prions, because remember they've taken on this unusual shape, they can persist in the environment for a really long time. At least 16 years, it's been shown with scrapie, probably longer than that. As far as sex and age, we know that in mule deer, prevalence in males is about twice that of females. Not in every herd, certainly in some herds for females, prevalence actually approaches that of males. We know the prevalence is generally higher in primate animals. That's the same thing we see in elk, tends to affect the primate animals, but we don't see a difference in sexes in elk. Both cows and bulls are affected equally with this disease. And this is a chart that shows you prevalence of CWD on the lower axis. Then on the vertical axis, that's the percentage of class 2 and 3 bucks. So as prevalence increases, then the number of class 2 bucks decreases. And that makes sense, right? If bucks are the primary carrier of this disease, then they only live about 2.5 years, then they're just not making it to that prime age class where they can turn into a class 2 or class 3 buck. So a class 2 buck is 20 to 25 inches, and a class 3 buck is greater than 25-inch antler spread. So I've circled the Laramie Mountains there. You can see it falls in very close to Goshen Rim, which is shown here as 9, and then 10 is South Converse, and finally 8 there is Bates Hole by Casper. But it's not just bucks that are affected by this disease, it's also does. And this is from a study that was done in the South Converse mule deer herd. You can see it circled there on that map just above the Laramie Mountains herd. And basically this was a study that went on for 4 or 5 years, just determining female survival. And they found that CWD negative does have a 79% chance of making it through the year, but CWD positive does only have about a 37% chance of making it. So overall, combined through those years, it varied between 65 and 73%. So you'd like to be around 80 to 80, a little over 80, to have a sustainable population. So you can see that this population is really having a hard go of it. But I think it's important to note here, it's not just CWD that's driving this population down. There's many things that affect the population, and CWD is just one more straw on the camel's back, if you will, that can really affect how a population rebounds should a drought get over, something like that. So there's many factors, of course, that affect the population. As far as genetics go, we do know that certain genetic profiles do influence the length of time animals survive with CWD. Unfortunately, there's been no true resistance has been identified yet, and there's been no documented immunity or recovery. But certainly, different genetic profiles can lengthen or shorten that incubation period. But still, the vast majority of animals die in about 2.5 years once they're infected. The worry is with animals that do have a resistant genotype, and I say resistant just because it's a longer incubation period, that those animals will then be available to shed prions in the environment for a longer period of time. So it's a catch-22 as far as the disease is concerned. We know that mountain lions selectively prey on CWD-infected animals, and modeling has suggested that wolves may actually decrease prevalence if they're able to identify those animals that are infected with CWD, maybe more efficiently than mountain lions do. As far as CWD and human health, laboratory studies have indicated there's probably a pretty substantial species barrier that keeps this disease from going to humans. That barrier is probably not absolute. There's been an ongoing study that's not quite complete yet, that they were able to transmit CWD to macaques by feeding them infected game meat. So the question is still out there. Well, it looks like there's a substantial barrier, but there's some worries too, where you can transmit it to macaques. The public health has done a significant amount of studies following causes of death in hunters, particularly within the CWD endemic areas. And so far, there's been no demonstrated link between human prion disease and ingestion of game meat. Nonetheless, the CDC and the World Health Organization recommend that positive animals not be consumed. Again, they just looking out and making sure that people minimize their exposure to prions. We know that prion is not inactivated by cooking. It takes incinerator temperatures to inactivate this protein. If you're worried and you happen to get a CWD positive animal, you can disinfect your hunting knives, butchering equipment, surfaces, stuff like that, by making a 40% bleach solution. We recommend that you use fresh bleach. The strength of bleach decreases the minute you open up the vial. So a good fresh bottle is always good mixed with cold water. You can mix 2 parts of bleach with 3 parts of water. That'll give you a 40% solution, and then you need to soak it in there for 5 minutes. The cleaner your instruments are before you put them in there, the better job you're going to do disinfecting. So clean them up real good with soap and water, and then go through a bleach cycle. All right, moving on to CWD in Wyoming. So now I'm going to talk about when we discovered it. I'll talk about what its distribution is, and then move on a bit into our surveillance. So we really don't know when this disease appeared in the state. Modeling suggests it was probably here since the 1950s, but again, it stayed at such a low level. We really didn't detect it until 1985, and that was in mule deer, elk in 1986, white-tailed deer in 1990, and a single moose in 2008. We've not detected a moose since then. This is a map of our surveillance efforts through the years, and you can see in the early years, from 1982 to really about 2000, this was really just a strange disease that was actually quite rare, and we really didn't think that this was that much of a big deal. And of course, you get BSE around 2002, 2003, and everybody's hair got on fire, and we thought that we ought to start looking for chronic wasting disease throughout the whole United States. So federal money became available. That enabled us to do a pretty good job with surveillance. And you can see from 2002, 2003, even into 2005, we sampled a lot of critters. And we sampled a lot of critters across the entire state. Well, then things start to wane. It didn't look like chronic wasting disease was going to be a human health concern. So you can see our surveillance kind of modeled that. And then if you go back and you think about that slide I showed about the South Converse mule deer study, that study showed that CWD was going to be a concern for our herds. And there was also other studies that were going on at the same time. So now we're starting to ramp up our surveillance, not for fear of human health, but for fear of herd health. So you can see this past year, we sampled more samples than we've ever sampled before. So keep in mind that graph that I just showed you. So this is 1998 to 2005. And I think by the time we got to 2005, we had enough samples from throughout the state that we really had a pretty good idea where this disease occurred and where it didn't. This map's a little bit misleading because this is just a map of the positives. So you remember that we did a lot of surveillance in southeastern Wyoming in the early years. So that's going to be a little bit darker because we identified a lot of positives. But nonetheless, you can see we had a few in south of the Black Hills, western slope of the Bighorns, and then of course the Bighorn Basin. So let's jump ahead. This is just 2006 through 2020. And you can see, again, southeastern Wyoming, eastern slope of the Bighorns, and then the Bighorn Basin, and on into the far western side of the state into Grand Teton National Park. It still didn't really take off up here in the Black Hills, not like it did in the Bighorns. But nonetheless, we now have CWD well scattered across the state. Now that's pretty dramatic, isn't it, when you go from here from 2005 to 2020. But remember, this is still a slow-moving disease. This took at least 15 years, right, to make it across the state when West Nile virus made it in 2. So we still consider this as a slow-moving disease. If we just take elk and look at the distribution, again, this is 2006 to present, you can see that CWD is not nearly as widely distributed across the state, and nor do we see the same prevalence levels in elk that we see that we do in our deer. So again, southeastern Wyoming, southern Black Hills, and then the eastern slope of the Bighorns as well as the Bighorn Basin. So, you know, in the early years, the way we used to do our surveillance was 2 approaches. One was a shotgun approach where we just did the very best we could across the entire state. We did that for several years. And then we changed our surveillance a little bit to where we were just focusing around the leading edge of the disease, just trying to determine where it occurs and where it didn't. And then we hit a few of our endemic areas just to see what was going on. And the problem is we just couldn't do a good enough job. There's too much land area to get through. We just couldn't do it. So 2 years ago, actually 1 year ago, we revamped our surveillance effort. And we decided that we really need good sample sizes in each herd unit, good statistical meaningful sample sizes. So what we've done is we're going to rotate our surveillance and we're going to focus on most of our herd units once every 5 years. And then we move on, we go to another herd unit. And our goal is to get 200 samples within 3 years in each of those herd units. Our emphasis is going to be on adult bucks and adult elk, both sexes. That does not mean we won't test whitetails. It doesn't mean we won't test fawns. It doesn't mean we won't test does. It means that when we're focusing our surveillance effort and our statistics, they're going to be based on adult bucks and adult elk. That doesn't, like I said, we'll test everything that you bring us. So this is a map of prevalence over time. This is the last 5 years, and this is based on adult buck prevalence. You can see Goshen Rim as well as South Converse and Project are some of our highest prevalences at 30%. And then that slowly fades out to that light blue color that you see, and finally to the white where we've not detected it in hunter-killed elk or hunter-killed deer. Those areas, though, that you see in gray are areas where we just don't have enough sample size to know what the prevalence is. So you can see there's a few of those areas in the state where we still have to work. But if you move to elk, there's a lot more. So you can see there's quite a few numbers of elk that we still need more information on before we get a good handle on prevalence. Nonetheless, you see our Iron Mountain herd is the highest in the state, between 10 and 15%. Laramie Peak is between 5 and 10%, and then we slowly fade out to those light colors, which is 1 to 5%, and then finally 0 in the far western herd units there.
Hank, we have a question from online. What percentage of deer harvested in Unit 60 are actually tested?
In 60?
Yes.
Maybe Mark can answer that. I don't have statistics with me right off the top of my
Can
head.
we hold off? I'll think about that.
Okay, we'll get you an answer to that question soon.
That's a good question, not very many, that's not an area we get very many samples from. So anyway, these last few slides I've got, there's only a few more that you have to endure here, but I'm gonna talk about some things that we can do as hunters, make a difference. For some reason it won't advance. Can you advance that for me, please? Thank you. Hunters, what can you do? Well, the number one thing you can do is submit samples for surveillance and monitoring. If you're a person who would prefer not to know your CWD results, just write it on that head tag that you submit with your sample. Do not notify, and we will not notify you. But getting those samples is really helpful to our surveillance, so we really encourage you to submit samples for our surveillance program. Finally, don't harvest animals that appear unusually thin or obviously sick. It's amazing how many animals are harvested that happen to be in the end stages of CWD. And we're just encouraging people maybe to spend a little more time looking at that animal before you pull that trigger. Consider testing that animal before you process the meat. And that can simply mean quarter and freezing the animal until you get those results back. We generally try and get those results back within 3 weeks, but if you can get that sample to the laboratory quickly, we can usually turn that sample around in a couple of days. Other things that help is limit environmental contamination and sources of infection. One of those things is to report animals exhibiting signs of CWD to the Wyoming Game and Fish so that we can remove those animals from the landscape. We know that carcasses transmit this disease, so we'd rather have those carcasses disposed of properly in a landfill. And then finally, follow carcass transport and disposal regulations, and I've got the next slide. I'll talk about that, about our carcass regulations, which some people aren't quite aware of. And then finally, the last point on this slide is to call the lab. If you've got questions, that's what we're there for. You can find our number online. It's pretty easily found, and I've also got it listed there at the bottom of the slide. So getting back to carcass transport regulations, I'm not going to read this whole thing out, but the first paragraph pretty much sums it up. That the head and entire spinal column of all deer, elk, and moose harvested from any hunt area in the state must remain either at the site of kill or disposed of in an approved landfill or incinerator after processing. So all that means is please don't take your carcass out and dump it off in the ditch. Don't take it out to some public property, BLM or whatever, and ditch it. Please dispose of those carcasses and parts properly in the landfill or an incinerator. So this whole regulation is online. Please be aware of it. It's really important in stopping the spread of this disease, or at least stemming it as best we can. Martin asked me to put this in about how taxidermists and processors can help. And it's very similar to that last slide of what hunters can do. Same thing, right? Collect samples for surveillance and monitoring. We make kits available for free, so anybody can get a hold of those. I've produced, I didn't produce, I didn't have anything to do with producing it, but they put my face on it, and there is a lymph node removal video online, and all you gotta do is Google Wyoming Game and Fish CWD, and you'll have a link to this video. It shows you how to collect your own tissues and how to submit that to the laboratory. So there's a lot of information online about chronic wasting disease, and we really rely on taxidermist processors, as well as all the sportsmen who attend these public meetings, to be a source of good information, accurate information back to other sportsmen. So again, we want to raise awareness and provide that accurate information. Proper disposal of carcass and parts, really important for taxidermists as well as processors. And then finally, same thing. If you have questions, call the lab. That's what we're here for.
There's no processors in this area right here. So we all end up doing it. And I've had real problems getting the samples to the lab by dropping them here at the office. I think we had 5, 6 samples last year that dropped and never got a result because I said we never received it. That's a link that needs to be.
We're aware of that link, and I think we may have talked to you several times last year as we were trying to find your samples. And we know that this is a weak spot here, dropping those samples off and getting them to the laboratory. But you bring up a really good point, and that is a problem that we have, is the time frame that it takes, even though it's only 50 miles here, because people batch them up until they get enough to make it worth sending. So whether that's in Cheyenne or that's in Cody or anything else, so that is an issue. CWD and what Game and Fish is doing. Again, a lot of information on our website, releases on social media, news releases, public meetings, etc. Again, just trying to get the word out and build awareness about chronic wasting disease. Increased CWD surveillance. Again, I've already talked about how we're revamping our surveillance effort. We also make sample collection available at each regional office, and that testing is free of charge. And those results should be available in less than 3 weeks. Again, they should be available in just a few days if you can get them to the laboratory and we have time to push them through the process. We have updated our CWD management plan. That was over a year in the making, and it was developed using scientific data as well as public and agency input. Finally, that plan was approved by the commission in July of 2020. And Martin will talk more about that in the next segment of the talk. So that's all I've got about CWD. I'm happy to entertain any questions.
We're working on this now.
Oh, okay. Sir, did you have any more?
No, it's fine.
There's home on the range processor here in Cheyenne. That we actually set up a check station there last year several times, so
It's not well publicized. I wouldn't use it anyway because I've been doing this for
sure.
40 years. But I've had people approach me, where can we get this processed? It's not well publicized.
Okay. Yeah, we can always do a better job, absolutely. Anything else for Hank, Robin?
Nothing right now. We did put a response to that question in the chat box for those of you online.
Thank you, Hank, appreciate it. So while we're queuing up the next, talk about our management plan, our statewide management plan. You can't really zoom around here. We have several game and fish folks, but you can just look at Hank and I tonight. So I'm going to talk next about our management plan, our statewide management plan that was passed by the commission, as Hank mentioned, last July. Myself and 31 other folks from around the state were part of a working group to come up with recommendations to our internal CWD management team. And then they came up with this plan. So, whoops. Okay, thank you. So there's a lot of things that are in the plan. It's 73 pages long. I am not going to bore you with that tonight. I'm going to talk about the meat and potatoes of the plan, the actual management strategies that we came up with as a game and fish department. So, cool. As Hank mentioned, we've learned a lot about CWD in the last 20 years, and just to touch up on that, we do know that CWD has impacts to our populations. We know that it has expanded. Hank showed you a very good map of where it was in 06 and where we're seeing it now. It's gone across the state, and I don't see it slowing down. We do know that it's, in most cases, bucks are twice as likely to have it as does. And we also know that the older age class bucks are more likely to have it than the younger age class of bucks. We also know that it can be just as high in whitetail deer herds. We know Hank went through a good explanation of how it's transmitted. It's kind of a wicked thing to think about that you can get CWD from the soil, from the environment. And so it's not something we're going to stop. And I want to emphasize that tonight, that we're not here to try to stop CWD, because we know we can't. Once it's out there, it's out there. What we would really like to do is reduce prevalence. If or you can reduce it from 23% down to 13%. That's a win, in my opinion. We do know that elk are at a much lower prevalence rate than deer for whatever reason, and we know it doesn't affect both sexes equally like it does, where it's equal sex distribution compared to deer, where it's more in the male population. So there's a lot we've learned. Samuel, what do I got to do here?
Very good.
Okay. So tonight I'm just going to talk about management strategies as it relates to artificial sources of concentration. In other words, things that bring deer into a small area that don't normally happen in the environment. And then we'll talk about strategies, hunter management strategies. The plan also talks about different regulatory actions. So those are things like we'll continue to make sure we do not have game farms. We're going to continue to work with other government organizations to address carcass disposal. Yeah, again, I will not worry those other topics. I just want to talk about how you guys as hunters can manage CWD. So the different strategies, what they're based on, how these came about, is they need to be based on the best available science. We want to use what's out there that's been done in other states and proved to work, seems to work. We want to apply that to Wyoming if we can. We learned through the planning process as a team, as a working group, that the public needs to be involved. We will not do any management plans or any management strategies without public involvement. And that's why you guys are here tonight. This is the initial stages of the strategy process. And then we also know that anything we do, we're not going to do short term. We've learned from other states that tried doing short term, or their plans were cut short because of public input, or more, for lack of a better term, public outcry. The public was not happy with what they're doing, and so they won't be able to evaluate what those management strategies are. So anything we do, we've got to be on board for a long period of time, 5 to 10 years. So artificial concentration. This is a really good example. It's not your typical example of folks up in Wisconsin feeding white-tailed deer. That's not what you want to see out there in the environment. That's not what we want to see with our wild cervids. And so we know, Hank explained very well again, that nose to nose, saliva, feces, these animals can spread these prions that way. So when you're bringing a large number of cervids into a small area, that's not good. It's just like when school starts every year, you bring all those kids that have been out into a small room, things are going to get passed pretty easy. So we want to try to avoid those. So examples of those in Wyoming are things like golf courses, parks, and just your backyards if you have ornamental trees or shrubs. These bring in deer that are unnatural. We also have issues with folks feeding deer, and we've got places throughout the state where that's not a healthy situation. And some cities have passed ordinances that you can no longer feed deer. And so we'll continue to address those situations as they arise. Another really a good source of artificial concentration is ag production, ag lands. Not trying to bash on ag lands, because agriculture is key to having a wide variety, wide diversity of wildlife in Wyoming. But we are taking the surface areas of the land and changing them. We're diverting water from reservoirs, creating irrigation systems that don't normally occur there. We're planting things that don't normally occur there, and that attracts deer. It just does. But if we didn't have CWD, that's fantastic. We're providing food, water, shelter, and space to cover for those species. But when you throw a disease like CWD on top of that, boy, it's really impactful to the population. So if there's ways we can address those, we would love to do that. Some of the things we could do to address these contamination areas, or what we call hot spots, is again, we work with the public and with the landowners to come up with strategies. These strategies could be anything from what we would really like to do and have our normal hunting seasons. Again, through this planning process, the public voiced their opinion very strongly that whenever possible, we would want to use hunting as a tool to reduce prevalence if we can. And that's what we like to do. So can we change our hunting regimes out there to address harvest in localized areas where we have these artificial sources of concentration? Can we do things in areas that are bringing or drawing these deer into them? Can we eliminate deer? Can we put up fences? Can we do something different with how we provide mineral to livestock? If there's ways to preclude deer from getting to those minerals. So these are, the second option to me is very benign and it is very easy to do. We just need to do it. We need to get people on board to do it. An example I like to bring up is, I'm out of Wheatland, and Wheatland is strong in ag, and we have an incredible irrigation system. We divert water from the Laramie River, bring it down into the Wheatland Flats, and grow a lot of crops, mainly alfalfa, corn, soybeans, sugar beets. We also have a lot of silage, and every year in March and April, I'm going out along with the game wardens and putting down deer that are in the final stages of CWD. They cannot move, they cannot walk, and so we have to physically go out there and dispatch them and remove them from the environment. And so if there's ways we can preclude deer from coming into those silage pits, we would love to try to do that. Okay, so let's just talk about hunting. Again, just to, as Hank mentioned, bucks are twice as likely to have it as does, and the older age bucks are more than likely to have it than the younger age bucks. So is there ways that we can manage our buck ratios to bring down those higher ratios, say from 30 bucks per 100 does down to 20 bucks per 100 does with our already existing hunting regulations that we have in place? So we can do things like increase license numbers. We can increase the season length. We could hunt in November in the rut when bucks are more vulnerable to harvest. There's a lot of things that we can do with what we already have. We would just have to implement those. We could also try to reduce the population. And this could be on a herd unit, a large population. We could look at it within hunt areas within the herd unit, or we can look at it with this small populations within a hunt area. So when you're reducing the population, this is unpalatable to a lot of folks that love mule deer, is you're gonna have to put in some doe harvest. And it's not just 1 year, you're gonna have to be on board to do it for many years to drive that population down, keep it at a lower density, and then see if that actually does anything for CWD prevalence. So it's doing something we normally do not like to do. We're gonna harvest a female segment of the population, and we're gonna do it for long periods of time. So that's the extreme. Okay? We can go from fencing off stack yards or silage pits to reducing overall herd populations. Again, with hot spots, as I mentioned, we have situations like golf courses, parks, and our normal hunting strategies cannot be played. We cannot use those in those situations because you just can't hunt there. And so we possibly could use sharpshooters or other ways, hunting at night vision. Those are not very palatable, but it could be a way to reduce densities in these public areas where we cannot use hunting. So, harvest management strategies. The big thing, if we go down this road, is we need public support. We need public buy-in. We need public to come to the table. We've got one gentleman here tonight. I appreciate you coming. And floor on. I need folks to spread the word to help get the word out if you're concerned about CWD. But we will not do anything without that public buy-in. And it's going to be done over long periods of time if we do anything. And yeah, that's about, I hit on that pretty hard. That's good. So finally, I like these far side jokes. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Honestly, we have not done anything for 20 years. We are a state that monitors. We're pretty good about doing surveillance, but we're not very good about actually implementing any kind of management. So it's time to do something. I'm willing to take that risk. I'm willing to take those hard steps and try something. And I'm here asking your support to see if you guys would like to come along and try something as well. So that is a really quick overview of our management plan. I would ask Robin if we have any questions. Sir, do you have any questions? I'm gonna
Yes.
leave the camera for an area and grab a drink. Go ahead.
I think you're missing one issue that's, southeast Wyoming has a real problem with, and that's the lack of access to hunt. Because once you go into an area, about the second day of the hunt, the wildlife moves off into areas adjacent, concentrates very heavily, and it becomes just an ambush thing going back and forth at that point. So that lack of access goes back in the wheatland area is really tough on that. You can't kill large numbers of deer because they move off into unattainable areas due to the lack of access.
Absolutely.
And that's contributing very heavily in my mind. I have one around Glendale. And I have seen on the west side of Glendale as many as 100 doe fawn in the latter part of October. If you're there the first 30 minutes of the day, then they are off into those private areas that can't be accessed until about 30 minutes before sunset. They tend to move back into the protection of the lake. So reducing numbers is going to be extremely difficult in most of those areas just because you can't access animals to reduce it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said.
Now, in the late 1940s, up in the Buffalo area, they had a huge problem in the Rock Creek Valley there with deer. And what they actually had to do at that point was to go in and have controlled hunts in which anyone that had a deer permit could go, and they used a sharpshooter group, mostly returning veterans from World War II, to go in and harvest deer. And then the people that had the permits left over took the deer and had them processed or processed themselves. So that's what this isn't unusual. This has been done many times before. The harvesting the mature bucks, the really nice bucks, becomes almost an impossibility with the lack of being able to get to them, because they're off immediately out of the area. But they come back during the rut area. And hunting those in the rut, if the idea is to reduce those numbers, we need to be hunting the rut for mule deer. Whitetails probably doesn't make a great deal of difference, but mule deer get plain stupid in the rut. And you could probably take high percentages then, just by not hunting does then, letting the does act as a decoy to bring the bucks back into those areas. So, just some observations.
Very, very valid points. Appreciate those. And again, I don't disagree with the access.
Okay.
Go ahead. You got some more on your mind. So.
Yeah. What happens when we go into these issues, reduce the numbers, reduce the permits? How do we handle, right now there's a serious problem in the state for many people. Hunting popularity is rising, permits are steady. We now reduce numbers, we have to reduce the hunting pressure in certain areas. There's no more permits in those areas, or it comes, what was generalized becomes a draw. What do we do with the displaced hunters? They can't draw.
Yeah, I'm not going to solve that question tonight.
No, but it's an issue that
I'll
the
guarantee you
public
that.
is going to be very sensitive to.
Yeah, yes.
Public input's important. I totally agree with that. But it doesn't take anybody long to realize you cut the number of deer in an area. There's not going to be as many permits. Where am I going to go hunt? So we need to think that out as to how we can help the public find other areas that may be more accessible. Or if I see deer going to the animal permit system very shortly for that reason, which means you won't get a deer permit every year. And that's going to be a tough issue.
Sure.
So.
Anything else? Okay. I can try to address a bunch of your questions after. Will that work?
No, that's no problem.
Okay. Okay. Well, I appreciate
Those are
it.
mostly
Those
observations.
Thank you so much for those observations. So, if you want to switch So Samuel's going to be switching to, and maybe I'll be able to answer some of those questions when I talk specifically about the Laramie Mountains herd unit. I realize you're in Glendo and the interstate splits that between two hunt areas, so.
Well, part of that is still.
It's still,
area.
yep. So we have it keyed up here and we'll get going. Okay, so now we'll talk about, we've learned about CWD, we've learned about our management strategies that are within our statewide plan. Now I'm going to talk about the Laramie Mountains herd unit, and all I want to do is educate folks tonight. Folks that are online, I'll mention this quick. We've got your email address, so we're going to send you guys a survey. Because they're all, hopefully you'll fill a survey out when you're done. To talk, yes, ma'am. Go ahead,
So,
Rob.
Mark, we have a question online. Can we?
You want to do it now or wait? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah.
Can we wait?
There's
I
a
don't care.
question online. Do you want
Yeah,
that?
go ahead. I don't care.
Will the quota numbers start to change for the 2022 seasons?
We don't know that since 2022 is a year, we're not even into 2021. So, I'm thinking 2023. That is a great question. I'm probably not standing with them. What I hope is if we do want to change things for 2022, we'll go through this process, gathering public input, and that'll be the only way it changes. I wouldn't be making any drastic changes without public input, but that would be the earliest season that we would implement change. Is he talking to you or just typing?
I'll make sure you heard it.
Okay. Sorry, folks, this is kind of awkward. Appreciate your patience if you're still online. I'll get through this in a fairly quick fashion, and then we'll have a chance to open it up for maybe verbal questions. So the Laramie Mountains Mule Deer Herd Unit, that consists of hunt areas 59, 60, and 64. Folks that have been hunting in this area for a long time, this actually used to be two different herd units. This is Highway 34. And can you see that, Samuel, when I do that? I have no idea. Okay, cool. So Highway 34 used to be a division line between the Laramie Peak Mule Deer Herd Unit and the Iron Mountain Mule Deer Herd Unit. We realized that the Highway 34 is not a permanent boundary. We know that there's more than 10% interchange between Highway 34. Anybody that's driven that road in the morning, evening, can contest that as deer are moving back and forth at a frequent rate. And so in around 2008, we combined those two herd units into one. And then when we went through a herd objective review process back around 2012, we went from 6 areas down to 3 hunt areas. And so we simplified things to help with simplifying management and also to make it easier for hunters so the regulations aren't as complicated. So that's the background of the evolution of hunt areas 59, 60, and 64. So when I talk about the population of this mule deer herd unit, we've got, I'm going to ask a dumb question. Can they see this? Is this stuff?
No, we can see it in the room, but they can see it.
Okay, cool. So on this graph is depicting what the population is doing. On this vertical axis is the population. On the bottom, this horizontal axis are the years. So for the last 20 years, the populations have been flowed, basically what wildlife populations do. The solid red line is where we'd like that population to be. So when we combine the herd units, we are trying to manage for 29,000 mule deer. That was an unrealistic, unattainable goal. Even without CWD, this herd is just not very productive. We do not have a lot of fawn survival year in and year out, so we do not add to the population. So we reduced the objective back around 2014 to 20,000 mule deer. And as you can see with this graph, we don't even come close to that objective. We have very conservative seasons, very few doe licenses that are available, so it's just not productive. This next graph really tells a clear picture of why it's not productive. These are fawn ratios. Again, we have the year on the years from 2011, the last 10 years, 2011 to 2020. And then on the vertical axis are our fawn ratios. How many fawns per 100 does each year when we go out and fly this in November. And the red line is the line needed, the number needed to maintain the population. Anything above that line, you're going to grow that population. Well, in the last 10 years, we've only done that 3 times. Back in 2014, we had phenomenal precipitation, conditions were just right. We had fawns coming out our ears, not only in the Laramie Mountains herd unit, but all of southeast Wyoming. All the adjacent herd units had around 80 fawns per 100 does. That was an anomaly, doesn't typically happen, especially in this herd unit. And so we're not growing this herd. And then if you look at buck ratios, we've got a lot of things going on here. Again, the bottom axis is your years. On the vertical axis are your buck ratios. How many bucks per 100 does? These 2 black lines, that is the range where we want to maintain our buck ratios. We want to maintain between 20 and 29 bucks for every 100 does out there on the landscape. That's the proportion we'd like to see. The blue lines, the blue bar graphs, are your total bucks. So that's your yearling bucks and everything older than a year. Right? The orange, I don't even know what that is. I guess that's red. The red bars are your mature bucks, so 2+ and older. So we did a really good job of being productive, having a lot of bucks on the landscape for hunters. It wasn't anything we did. That's just the way this herd performs. We have a lot of private land. A lot of places for their deer to go, like you mentioned, sir, and they're just not going to get hunted. Okay? And so the orange lines, we're within that zone almost every year, and then several years we're well above it. Hindsight, this probably was not a smart thing to do. Knowing what we know now about CWD, I should have been a better manager. And I should have been trying to manage for that lower end of our ratios. But people love mule deer. People want to see as many bucks as they can. So we thought we were doing great things by having that many bucks out there. So that's on me. That's on me. That's a hard lesson I learned as a manager. And it's something I hope as we go forward, we're going to take really hard looks, not just southeast Wyoming, but the whole state. So, in closing with this graph, deer are living. They're making it, if they make it past 6 months, they're living to be 1, 2, and 3 years old. But as I continue down with some more slides, they're not making it past that 3-year stage. Right? All these deer that you see, these mature bucks, those are basically 2- and 3-year-old deer. Right? And I'll try to demonstrate this here in the next few slides. A good way, instead of just looking at a graph and saying, okay, that's 20 bucks per 100 does, that's hard to visualize. So we worked with the University of Wyoming to come up with some visualization to help you have a grasp what those look like. So this graph, or this picture on your left, sir, I guess it'd be the left and everybody out in Zoom land, that's showing a population. The dark deer are the does, the light colored deer are the bucks. That's showing there's 20 bucks for every 100 does. That's what you would see out in the field. If you go over to your right, that's 29 bucks per 100 does. So they slightly increase. Perhaps this is all private land dominated and we just have more bucks there because they're not susceptible to harvest. Right? Gives you a pretty good idea. And it's a pretty good array of type class 2 and class 3 bucks on the landscape. So Hank mentioned this in his slides. He talked about class 2 and class 3. Starting back in 2012, we started to collect data on antler width. And we wanted to look at antler, what that data is telling us over time. What is that trend doing? Are we seeing more class 3s? Are we seeing fewer class 3s? What is really happening on the landscape? Because we weren't doing that beforehand. And so as you look at these pictures, you can see a class 1 is less than 19 inches. Class 2 is 20 to 25, and class 3 is greater than 26. So when we started collecting this data, what we noticed was during the harvest, we're out in the field, we are trying to get our hands on as many deer as we possibly can to actually physically measure those antlers. And we can record that data and go back and analyze that data. what we were seeing is there was some harvest, there were some class 3s out there, not a lot, but there were some class 3 out there, but we were not seeing them when we were flying in November, when we call our post-con surveys. We just weren't seeing that percentage or that class on the landscape. And then starting back in 2018, we started collecting teeth. And the question we were asking is, how old is this deer? If it's positive, how old was it when it came down to CWD? And so for 3 years, we've collected data in the Laramie Mountains herd unit. We pulled a lot of teeth. And what we found out, we wanted to see is there a correlation? Is a class 3, is that a 7-year-old deer? We had a general idea, but we really wanted to make sure. So on average, what we did find was a class 1 deer was about 3.5 years old, class 2 was about 4.5, and class 3 was a 5.5-year-old deer. There's always exceptions. You can't take this for the gospel. Sometimes you have a 6-year-old deer that's only going to grow 18 inches wide. Okay? But on average, that's what we found. So if we break these down into our data for the last 10 years, or from when we started collecting this antler data, again, so this graph, the bottom's the deer, and we're looking at percentages, class 1, 2, and 3 in the harvest. These are deer we get our hands on and measure. Okay? And then the vertical axis is the percent. Okay? So what you should expect as managers is you should expect a higher percentage of class 1. You guys have a lot more younger deer out there in the population. As time goes by, you're losing those deer to disease, predation, getting hit, hunting. So you're going to have a smaller percentage of older deer. That just makes sense. So this 2012, this is what I expected. About 70% of our deer I would expect that are harvested are class 1. And then about 20% are class 2. And then about that 10% are class 3. But these class 3s, this aqua color, that's our class 3s, the purples are class 2, and the chartreuse are your class 1s. We had quite a few class 3s in these 2012 to 2015, but then as the years progressed, we're starting to see a decline of those in our harvest. And then when we went out and flew, so we flew and we typically fly in November, December, and we're counting anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 deer. We're getting a pretty good idea of what is out there. And what we've seen from 2013, if you're just looking at that aqua color graph, is it really declines as the years progress. It's hard to depict, but a good trend line shows that this is declining. And when you look at this compared to the rest of the state, if you look at just the Laramie Mountains herd unit, on average, for the last 12 years, the majority of our deer are class 1, 78%. The statewide average is 71%. Our class 2, we start to drop. The statewide average is 24%. The Laramie Mountains is 20. And then when we get to our class 3 deer, the statewide average is 5, and we're down there at 2. So that's telling me as a manager, CWD is having an effect on our male population, particularly our older male population. Now, if we look at just what CWD has been doing in this herd since 1997, so again, on this bottom axis, this horizontal axis of our years, the first vertical axis is the number of animals we test. The secondary axis over here on the right is prevalence. So the red line is prevalence, percent prevalence. And if you look at this over time, it started around 15% back in 97 when we had a pretty good sample size. And as Hank mentioned, there's funding became available because there was a scare of bovine encephalopathy, mad cow disease. There was a scare, so funds became available. And just like the statewide sample numbers went up, the numbers in Laramie Mountains went up because we had the funding, we had the employees to go out there. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort to collect these samples. Well, we had it. And then it decreased over time. And then as that Hank mentioned, that South Converse herd, we realized, okay, we're not a human health. We're not worried about human health. That's not what we do. We're wildlife health. And we knew this was having a negative effect on our deer populations. So we really started to ramp up what we were collecting for samples. So these are statistically valid samples. We are pretty good in the Laramie Mountains about collecting CWD samples. And so over time, what you can see is this disease, as Hank mentioned, it's very slow. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's slowly increased. Where back in 97, we're around 15%. Now we're around 23%. And what we know from other states, anything above 10% is having population effects. Okay? So we're at levels where we're knowing we're having major population effects. And we also know that it just didn't start overnight in 1997 at 15%. This thing probably, as Hank alluded to, was probably back in the 1950s when it first came on the landscape. So some environmental contaminations within this herd unit that are very evident every year, year in and year out. As I mentioned, we've got areas that those deer come off the Laramie Mountains in higher elevations, come to the east slope, and eventually end up down in the lower elevations within ag practice, ag fields. The majority of those are hay fields, but they're also silage pits. Again, spend a lot of time, too much time, killing deer in March. And that, to me, again, is, you see that year in and year out, the more you see it, it's like, this is not good. We should be doing something. Same thing with water. It's another source of unnatural densities of deer, but they need water. So it's a catch-22. Should we get rid of the water or should we provide water? Those are things we have to decide. Another really good picture to show prevalence, another visual concept here is, say we want to get a good sample, a nice statistical valid sample of what's out there. What is our true prevalence? Well, there's no way we're going to sample every single deer in the field. But if we can get a small enough sample that's representative, say around 20%, and we those hunters bring those deer to us, we sample those hunters, it should give us a pretty good idea of what's going on. So out of those 5 deer, if one of them turns up positive, that's telling us we're around 20% prevalence. Well, the big picture here, and what I want you guys to take away is, if we're at 20% prevalence, how many deer are dying? So the gold deer are deer that you would not have within the next 18 months because they would die from CWD. So you're losing a large population of male deer every year when you're at those around 20% prevalence. And you have to assume those have it around 10% prevalence. Another thing we looked at to validate, okay, is this really happening in older age bucks? So again, we started collecting tooth data. I wish we would have done this starting back in 2002, but we got on board starting in 2018. And what we found is this pie chart represents all the positive deer for the last 3 years within the Laramie Mountains herd unit. And then we're able to break those out by age. And based on this pie chart, well over 75% are within that 3 to 5 years of age. Very few that are 1 and 2 year old, and very few that are 7 and 10. And honestly, we do not have very many 7 and 10 year old deer come through our chest station. They are just not there. And this tooth data validated that. So where do we go from here? This is where I need folks' help. As managers of this herd unit, we would really appreciate your input. So I'm going to pick on you, sir, since you're the only one that came. We have surveys. Robin, again, is going to have emails from everybody that zoomed in, correct, Robin?
And I can put those surveys on the webpage tomorrow.
Oh, cool.
On the Laramie page.
Okay, so these surveys will be available for anybody to fill out, and can you put my email address to return them? How would they return?
Yes.
Okay, so she'll have an email return. It'll be mine. Fill them out. What we're asking is, what's your knowledge of CWD? What are some practices within our plan that you're willing to explore? And also, if you're willing to sit on a working group to come up with strategies, management strategies or recommendations for this herd unit. So that's what I just said there. So if we do get folks that are interested, and so far after the first 2 meetings, I have over 7 people that said they'd like to invest their time, energy, and effort in sitting on a working group. I'll take as many as I can, and then we'll go from there. We'll filter that out. But again, we would meet in the winter of 2022, I've got to get my years straight, 2022, to come up with recommendations for not this coming season, but the following season. That would be that would be the ultimate goal. If we just come up with some minor recommendations, I would love that too. I just want to start somewhere, and I can't start without the folks that we're managing the wildlife on behalf. Can't start without you guys investing some time and energy. So with that, I will quit talking and ask Robin if she has any questions, or sir, if you have any questions after that, that I didn't answer for you. You're good? Okay. Sorry, you're the only guy here. I'm gonna pick on you. Robin, how are we in Zoom land?
Nothing right now.
Okay, so thank you, sir. Thank you, folks out there. You guys can't see it, but we have about 18 red shirts here. So thank you guys for coming out and escaping the heat. So that's it.